Yo, what's going on guys, Arekkz here, welcome back to another Monster Hunter World video. And in today's video, I want to do something a little bit different. As you guys know, during E3 there were some gameplay demonstrations of Monster Hunter World. However, for those of you guys that didn't attend, unfortunately the only thing you have to go on right now is a trailer and of course the videos that I've been uploading. And while there is going to be a live stream on June the 20th in Japan where we will be getting our first glimpse of gameplay, so of course I'll keep you guys covered on that. I'll have the gameplay for you and I'll tell you guys everything you need to know. Before then, I thought what I would do is recap my demonstration that I had in the multiplayer segment. That was at Sony's booth. Can I just sort of talk you through how the hunt went, some of the different changes, some of the sort of like new features, and effectively try and describe what it was like to see that demonstration. So, while I appreciate it won't necessarily be gameplay, hopefully this will kind of shed some light on the sort of general hunting flow, how things played out, and of course how some of those new gameplay systems affect the way that you'll now hunt your monsters. So, if you do enjoy this, then like would be super appreciated. Comment down below if you have any questions, and of course, let me know what you guys think based on the stuff you've heard so far. So to begin with, when you start your quest, you actually fly in on this little wyvern. Every single hunter has one of these. We saw these in the trailer, and this is also the same bird that you use, or the same wyvern you use to fast travel back to the base camp. And similarly, if you call your flare in, and your hunters then use the drop-in multiplayer system to come and join you, they will also fly in on these. So we dropped in at the very beginning at the base camp and we met this sort of guild lady, not entirely sure what her name was, but she is effectively our quest giver and she was fully voiced. So instead of, say, you know, having your missions, dropping in and then kind of just running off and doing what you would normally do, she sat there and spoke to us. Of course, this was a sort of tutorial focused mission, so it was one of those ones that kind of introduces you to the game, tells you what you need to do, but either way, she kind of spoke about everything, kind of set the scene for us, and she also spoke to us a few times throughout the hunt as well. If any of you guys saw my kind of Monster Hunter Online gameplay I did at some point last year, then sort of similar to that, whereby when you drop in, you have like a quick cutscene with sort of the quest person there. They kind of tell you what you need to do. It was sort of like that, but definitely a lot better, given that it was, you know, fully voiced, and of course you get kind of cutscenes at the same time. So that is effectively how it starts. You then kind of walk on from there. And the very first thing we started doing was kind of sort of exploring the area, gathering from things. So there was some honey hanging from a tree, and they kind of demonstrated the fact that you can just literally walk past or run past and grab it. So you didn't have to sort of, you know, get on your knees and start gathering. Similarly, they walk past a bush and they just grab some herbs on the fly. So that is, of course, super useful because if you're running away from a monster and you can sort of run through a bush and grab something, then it might give you some herbs you need to make a potion. However, at this point, they then switched over to focus on the new Scout Flies mechanic. Now, bear in mind, because Monster Hunter World takes place in a big open map, there are no loading zones. You no longer have to kind of go between sort of 8 to 12 areas randomly trying to find the monster, at which point you then paintball it. Now, because the world or the map is fully open and the monster kind of moves around as they please, if you didn't have a means to track them, it would effectively be like trying to chase a ghost because, you know, you don't have specific areas you can sort of, you know, go to and then know that they'll spawn there because they could just be roaming however. So Scout Flies work like this. Basically, around the map, you will have footprints, you'll have like mucus on trees, and this is all highlighted in green. And you walk over to it and you effectively scan it or analyze it. And then as you do this, your Scout Flies level up. There's a little UI element on the right side of the screen, and you will effectively have a bar that goes up. So once you've, say, seen like 3 footprints or gathered some mucus from trees a few times, the Scout Flies will then level up, and at this point they are then able to track the monster. So think of it, you know, just general tracking. Like if you had like a sniffer dog, you showed it a piece of cloth from like someone's clothes or something, it then has the scent, and that's effectively how the Scout Flies work. So your hunts then sort of start out in this kind of discovery phase where you're basically sort of, you know, trying to like explore the area, find signs of the monsters, and then of course once you've got that, once you've got the quote-unquote scent, so to speak, you then begin pursuing the monster. Now on the way to the kind of monster in question this time around, which was Anjanath, they took the time to show some of the other ways to like interact with the environment. So on your arm, on your left arm, you actually have this new sort of cannon slash utility item. It has a number of different uses. You can gather items from around you and you can kind of put rocks into it and use them to sort of like fire out. You can also fire out sort of mini bombs on them. Plus you also have a grappling hook on it. Now this grappling hook has many different uses, but initially in the demo they used it to sort of explore the area. So there are sometimes like branches high up and you can actually grab onto sort of specific parts. You can't just grab onto everything, so there are sort of grapple points. But you can use this to climb around the level, and also sometimes if you're fighting the monster in that particular area, then you can use this to kind of get an aerial advantage, drop down and do like a mounting attack, different things like that. So they were sort of demonstrating this as they were moving around, and then gradually they started working towards the monster's location. Now, to begin with, they discovered Anjanath in this really close, tight cave, and this is not typically somewhere you want to fight. You know, if you've played Monster Hunter games before, fighting in sort of tight spaces is probably not the best thing. And in Monster Hunter World, monsters have a lot more animations. The way they kind of move isn't quite so like predictable or regimented as it has been previously So especially, you know, considering that, you definitely don't want to fight it in this sort of environment. So they use this as a great opportunity to demonstrate how you can then lure monsters away. They threw on a mantle, which is this sort of cloak thing. In the gameplay trailer, we've seen the ghillie mantle, so effectively it looks like a ghillie suit. You throw it on top of you. There is a UI element at the top screen. It seems like these do have a sort of cooldown timer, so you can't just throw it on all the time. Like if a monster sees you, you just throw it on and disappear. So there are going to have to be times where you can and can't use it, but they threw this on, and they then used the arm cannon to throw rocks to effectively kind of lure the monster away. Think like Metal Gear Solid, if you kind of knock on a box and like a guard comes to check you. That is the same sort of thing they were doing with the monster. They were using the ghillie mantle to conceal themselves and then just basically throwing rocks ahead to sort of use the sound to lure the monster out of the cave so they can actually kind of like switch to an area that is far better to engage it in. Now, another thing worth mentioning as well is that monsters, depending on the kind of type of monster, they're not always going to engage you straight away. So again, previous Monster Hunter games, if you get in the area, it sees you, then your battle basically begins. Whereas in Monster Hunter World, it is entirely possible for a monster to walk straight past you, because of course if you haven't attacked it or you haven't sort of shown it that you are a threat, then there are times when it just wants to kind of exist in the ecosystem, so you don't necessarily always have to engage straight away. However, do bear in mind that monsters do now have smell as well, so that is another thing you need to contend with. While yes, you don't have loading zones or kind of like places to hide behind, now if the monster is chasing you, there are so many things you need to think about because you have nowhere really to hide properly, and even with things like ghillie mantles, if it can smell you, then you're definitely not going to be safe all the time. However, back to the actual demonstration, they then started luring the Anjanath out into a nice open area where they can start fighting. So this was the first chance we got to see some actual combat. Now, the hunter we were following had a greatsword. The main weapons we got a chance to see during the demonstrations were greatsword, bowgun, and bow. There was a sword and shield user a little bit later in the background, but sadly we didn't get too much detail on that. So on the greatsword front, we got quite a few new moves. Now do bear in mind, I mentioned in my previous video, hunter arts are not making a return, but weapons do have some new moves. They look a lot more fluid now. There are a lot more sort of like nuanced animations in the way you do your attacks. The greatsword has this cool sort of shoulder barge attack where you'll do your normal charge attack, and then when it slams down and you sort of do your upswing, you can then go from an upswing into a shoulder barge, which is really, really awesome. Plus, you now have this sort of red glow effect that goes around your hunter to effectively indicate a charge move. So when you start charging, you start glowing red. It looks really cool. It's kind of sort of hard to explain it properly until you can actually see it for yourself, but this is basically your indicator that you are charging. So instead of the actual weapon itself flashing, your hunter instead starts to sort of glow. So that is something you'll see or you'll notice when you first get to see some gameplay for yourself. A few other things worth mentioning about the greatsword: it is still a slow weapon. It still kind of like behaves how it should do, but there are definitely more opportunities to effectively, you know, roll cancel out of moves, so you don't necessarily have to be quite so clunky. So you will still have to, you know, be very thoughtful about your moves, but not necessarily to the point where some of those moves will then leave you annoyingly open just based on the way the kind of gameplay system works. So after this point, they then decided to try and use some of the environment in the fights. So a couple of things worth mentioning. There is effectively what I'm going to call like a flash fly. That's not what the actual name is, but I'm not entirely sure what it's called at this stage. But these are sort of flies that are floating on the map, and if you shoot them, they will then detonate into effectively environmental flash bombs. So they use this as a means to then blind the Anjanath, so they can then go and do some more damage, they can attack it. They were actually in the demonstration really trying to sort of cut the tail off. It was really, really difficult for them to do this. They did manage to do it at the latter part of the demonstration, but the hitboxes seem to be a lot more precise this time around, so it is actually a genuine challenge, especially when you consider how tall that monster was. The other environmental thing they had a chance to use were, I mentioned them before, these sort of frogs with these big glowing bellies, and you basically kick them and they pulsate for a few seconds and then they explode, and they are effectively environmental shock traps or paralysis traps. If they explode as the monster is approaching, then you'll get kind of a free 3 or 4 second paralysis, which is really, really useful because of course if you don't necessarily have a trap, then it's also a means to get some free damage in. So definitely as you're playing, you're going to be spending a lot of time paying attention to the environment, really sort of like looking at your surroundings, seeing what you can use, and not just thinking about the items you have at your own personal disposal. Speaking of items, of course, there was a time when they kind of started getting low on health, so of course they managed to use a potion whilst moving. You do move slower whilst you're drinking a potion, but you are not stuck stationary, nor do you flex afterwards, so it is a lot more kind of realistic in that respect, and of course you can then be a little bit more tactical about where you place yourself, or of course how you react to certain situations. There is also a radial menu as well, so you can quick select certain items. In the bottom right hand corner, you'll have your typical menu that you've always kind of associated with Monster Hunter. You bring it up and you use L or R to scroll left and right, but there is also a radial menu where you can select, I think it's about 8 items, 8 to 10 items, and you then use the right stick to flick it around, and of course you can then quick access things like that. So here is of course where they had their flare, a few of the other items, things like potions and, you know, other things you kind of typically want to use at a regular basis. Moving on from there, they then took the monster to another area, and in order to do this, they actually used a second mantle. This one is called the Challenger Mantle. Now, you haven't seen this one yourself, but if you just picture how the Ghillie Mantle looks, this one instead had black, shiny scales on it, so it was effectively like a sort of scaly cloak, and this one was designed to draw the monster's attention constantly, so you can then use this to effectively force the monster to chase you, and you can then take it to like different parts of the map. So they then used this as an opportunity to first take it to another area where there were some low-hanging vines that were kind of effectively supporting a rock that had fallen down from the mountains. Now this is quite hard to actually pull off, but if you can get the monster right underneath it and you can actually shoot the vines, then the rock can drop down. Now this does a considerable amount of damage, hence why it's not the easiest thing to do. To give you guys some context, of course there are damage numbers now when you're attacking. You can turn them off, but they are there, and if you attack, you know, your regular attacks were doing anywhere from sort of 5 to 10 damage per hit based on where you're hitting the monster. A rock dropping on a monster did about 500 to 600 damage, so that is a considerable amount of damage. So they're definitely things you're going to want to do, but they are not the easiest things to orchestrate because, of course, monsters move around a lot, and if you shoot the rock and it falls down and the monster's not there, then of course you've wasted your opportunity. However, following this, they then decided to lure the monster even further up the mountain, and they actually got to this kind of big opening where there was a Rathalos. Now this is a great part in the demonstration where they sort of showed how the hierarchy, the monster hierarchy works, or the sort of food chain. This is a very important thing in Monster Hunter World. There is a very clear food chain, a very clear monster hierarchy, and of course if you take a smaller monster in the vicinity of a bigger monster, then they will actually fight it out. It's not like before where, say, if, I don't know, a Rathalos and a Rathian were in the same area and they sort of swung their tail, they'll hit each other by accident. This time around, they will actually deliberately fight one another. So you can use this as a genuine strategy. Now, do of course bear in mind that every single hunt is different, so it's not like where you go on a quest and it'll say, right, in this quest you could have Anjanath and Rathalos. Like, the Rathalos might be there, it might not. It flies around, you know, it exists in the world, so there are chances it'll be there. It just so happened during the demonstration it was, so they then lured the monster there, and of course they've been fighting it for a good 10 minutes, so it was already slightly weak, so they effectively then were able to sit back and let Rathalos start fighting this monster. You then picked it up and effectively just threw it away, so you can basically use bigger monsters to deal with some of the smaller monsters for you. Of course, with Anjanath out of the picture, the focus then switched to Rathalos, and this is where the multiplayer segment of the demonstration came in. They decided that Rathalos was far too powerful to take on alone, so they then went to the radio menu, selected the flare, and fired into the sky, at which point the other players then flew in on their wyverns, and we then had a full team of 4. 1 bow user, 1 heavy bungo user, 1 greatsword user, and also 1 sword and shield user. Now, during the downtime of the demonstration, they also showed that you can actually use your wyvern to fly back to base camp, so it's a fast travel mechanism. This is only usable when you are out of combat, so if if the monster's there, you can't just suddenly use it like a Farcaster, nor can you just sort of, run away before you're about to die. You have to be away from the monster, but you can then use this to kind of go back and change your gear. It is worth mentioning you can only change gear and weapons at the base camp. You can't just grab another like 10 potions, so it's not going to be like an easy way to just kind of refill items, but it is mainly so that, because of course the way that the hunts play out, if you don't necessarily know a monster's going to be there, and then say a Rathalos turns up and you completely haven't planned for this, then you can of course adjust your strategy accordingly. For the second part of the multiplayer demonstration, they then switched screens from the greatsword user to the bow user. And this is the other weapon we got a chance to kind of look at in depth, and it is really, really awesome. I have always been a blade master, but honestly the bow is probably one of my favourite things that I saw all show. It has a really cool fade step, which is effectively like a side step you can do after a shot. You charge up, you fire your shot, you then side step out, so it's kind of like a sort of quick cancel. And you can go from like a fade step into a second shot, and it seems like there's a sort of 3-hit combo in this. It's like shot, fade step, for shot, fade step, and then after the third one, you strike the ground, you light your arrow on fire, and you effectively have a free fire arrow. Now, I'm not entirely sure at this stage whether that was tied to a specific ammo type equipped, or whether that is part of the kind of inherent bow combo, but it was very, very awesome. Now, for those of you guys that were kind of worried about sort of the combat system being dumbed down, there are still all the kind of finer details. So bows do still have critical distance. They have the kind of same way of displaying the correct shots, whereby when you land the shot, the actual screen itself shakes to indicate that you're at the right distance. However, there is a new system in place whereby if you're really far away, to the point where your bow shots wouldn't actually hit or wouldn't do any damage, then it actually says on screen that you are out of range. So that is, of course, very useful. During the fight, they were then at this kind of like elevated point in the mountain, and Rathalos then decided to use the environment to effectively turn the tide in battle. There was a dam with like a load of kind of wood or twigs or kind of like fallen down trees that were sort of holding this water behind. Rathalos then destroyed this, and this massive flood of water then just sort of rushed down the mountain, pushed all the hunters off, and knocked them into a completely different area. So much like how you are able to use the environment to, you know, your advantage, so too can the monsters. So in this situation, we then fell down into a small den, and of course this is not the most ideal place to fight a Rathalos, but it flew down after us, and of course then the hunters had to fight in a much more enclosed environment. And that is pretty much it, because at that point they didn't actually finish off the Rathalos. The demo was only about 20 minutes. They made some fair progress, you know, they managed to kind of like knock it out of the sky, they managed to get it sort of like limping at one point, but they sadly ran out of time, so that is effectively where the demo ended. But it did a really, really good job of showing off a lot of these new systems, showing how you can use the environment to your advantage, showing how you track the monsters, how you can use some of these new systems to, you know, hide from the monsters, lure them to different areas. And honestly, it was such an incredible experience to watch. I cannot wait for you guys to actually be able to see some gameplay, because the trailer, while it's cool, it doesn't really give you much context to what's actually going on. So on June 20th, when the live stream happens, I will definitely do a complete breakdown video for you guys, showing you exactly how these new systems work. I'm not entirely sure what that live stream will show just yet, but hopefully if it shows anything like what we saw at E3, then for any of you guys that are still on the fence, this should definitely sell you on the game. But either way, that's it for the time being. That's kind of a quick recount of the demonstration that I had a chance to watch. I will be following up tomorrow with a much more in-depth video on basically everything we currently know about Monster Hunter World, so do stay tuned for that. But for the time being, thank you for watching, take it easy, catch you next time, peace out.